Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. Welcome to The Chinese Lady, Afong Moy in Early America with Nancy Davis. I'm Jenny Chamberlain with Beaverton City Library. This event is part of the library's community-wide reading program, One Book, One Beaverton, which this year is in celebration of the novel, The Many Daughters of Afong Moy by Jamie Ford. To learn more about the program and the associated upcoming events, please visit our website at beavertonlibrary.org/onebook. This presentation will be recorded and we'll post it to the library's YouTube channel in the weeks following the event. If you have questions for our presenter, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit them rather than the chat. She will answer as many of your questions as there is time for at the end. And if you're on a mobile device, you may need to tap your screen at the top or bottom to make the Q&A button appear. And feel free to put your questions in as they occur to you throughout the talk. You don't need to wait till the end. All right, our presenter tonight, Nancy Davis, is Curator Emerita at the National Museum of American History. A scholar working at the intersection of object studies and history, she has co-curated Smithsonian Institution exhibitions on migration and immigration, on Asian American life, the history of American business, and women's history. She is the author of the book, The Chinese Lady, Afong Moy in Early America, and a biography of Afong Moy in American National Biography. Davis received her PhD in American Studies with a concentration on Asian influence on American culture from George Washington University. She has been an associate professorial lecturer at George Washington University and at the University of Mary Washington, adjunct professor at the University of Baltimore, and lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University. And now I will turn it over to Nancy.
Thanks so much, Jenny. I really appreciate this opportunity to chat with you about Afong Moy. But I should say that I've been impressed with the research work that has been done in Oregon on the Chinese community. And I really appreciated the winter 2021 Oregon Historical Society Quarterly that focused on the Chinese diaspora in Oregon. I have that issue nearby and I refer to it a lot. So I really appreciate all the work that's going on in Oregon. So I know, as Jenny mentioned, all of you are reading the novel, The Many Daughters of Afong Moy by Jamie Ford, as I have been doing. And during the time that I was reading the book, I attended a theater performance of Ragtime. Some of you may know that. It's a performance based on E.L. Doctorow's novel of the same title. And this well-known novelist often placed historical characters in historical contexts alongside historical figures, as he did in Ragtime. And Doctorow said about this, the historian will tell you what happened, the novelist will tell you what it felt like. And after seeing the play, I realized that in a lot of ways, Ford was really providing what Afong Moy's life might have really felt like. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting way of thinking about it. But as an historian, I really don't have problems introducing readers to historical figures through fictional episodes, as long as it's made clear from the beginning that liberties have been taken with historical facts, because I think it's important for people to know that. This would be the case with the book that you've been reading, as well as the play, which some of you may know about, is called The Chinese Lady by Lloyd Hsu. It's also based, interestingly enough, on Afong Moy's life. And when my book came into print, which was in 2019, we then realized that our work had intersected. And then after reading his script, I suggested to him some perhaps factual changes, which he included in later productions. The play has been staged around the country, so catch it if you can. It's been around for about 3 years. What's been really interesting for me is that I have been able to work really closely with some of the productions that have happened around the country. And what I have typically done is to meet with actors on the site at rehearsals and kind of give them historical background on Afong Moy within the context of her time in China and in America. And I think, at least is what the actors have told me, that they can more fully portray her when they know these historical details, when they feel kind of comfortable understanding Afong Moy by knowing her history. So as you have been reading the book, you may have wondered how Ford's Afong Moy differs from what we know of her from historical research. And I think it's good to start from what we know of her life in China and then her travels to America in 1834. So to research her life and to understand the environment of her city, which was known as Guangzhou, which was then, and even some people still refer to it as Canton, I traveled to China in 2015. I went to a lot of archives, but particularly to the Guangdong Provincial Archive to determine and to figure out whether any mention had been made of her travel to America or anything about her life at all. And most unfortunately, there was nothing. However, what I did find, which I thought was really important, were the circumstances of her time in Guangzhou in 1833 and then in early 1834. And this was made clear by the very small excerpt I found in the archives that indicated that a fund had been established by foreigners for flood relief for the Chinese poor. I found too, when doing research there, that in August of 1833, 36 inches of rain fell in that area in that month. The rain caused, as you can imagine, unprecedented flooding and a complete loss of the rice harvest. And then, of course, mass starvation. The Chinese Repository, the main kind of foreign newspaper in Guangzhou, stated that it was pretty common, sadly, to see parents selling their children in the street to anyone who could feed or house them. And so at this time, there was a lot of turmoil and tumult in Guangdong province, her homeland. This, I think, really did contribute to her leaving. There are some American newspaper accounts that Afong Moy's parents did receive monies from American merchants for her extradition. But there is no evidence of a marriage or any recorded family ties, such as Ford notes in his novel. So though I need to say that the type of marriage he notes was commonplace in China. So one of the more exciting aspects of my research was to find at the National Archives here in Washington, D.C., the manifest of the sailing ship Washington, on which Afong Moy came in October 13th, 1834. There, her name was listed, and it was a huge, wonderful time to see it, listed on the passenger manifest, and it was spelled A-U-P-H-M-O-Y, but certainly phonetically, they would have said Afong Moy. What was additionally listed on the manifest was the name of Augusta Aubert. She was the wife of the ship captain, and there was also another unnamed Chinese female servant listed on the manifest. So this is a really important aspect of Afong Moy's story, being revealed by these names on the passenger manifest. it became clear to me then that Afong Moy didn't travel to America, solely and by herself, but was chaperoned by an older American woman, and she had a Chinese attendant. I'm sure the accommodations on ship were not delightful. I read a lot of diaries about ship trips and vessels at this time in 1834, and the accommodations were really not pleasant. But Afong Moy wasn't kept in the hold of a ship for 3 months, as I think Ford would indicate in his novel. So knowing these names was pretty wonderful, and I continued to do research on Augusta, the ship captain's wife, and found that she was the first foreign Caucasian woman to be permitted into the city of Guangzhou. And I found that this was stated again in a New York Times article at her death. It's unusual because foreign women were explicitly forbidden by the Chinese to enter into any Chinese territory. And you can understand from their point of view, they had a great fear that if women were allowed into these areas of China, they would establish families, and then there would be a foothold, a foreign foothold in China. So they were totally forbidden to come into Canton, Guangzhou. But that she was permitted to enter as Afong Moy's chaperone meant that the removal of Afong Moy would have been condoned and accepted in advance by the Chinese, which is pretty remarkable. Augusta and her husband, Benjamin Aubert, had a really instrumental and early role in Afong Moy's life in China and America. Her arrival in New York City in mid-October of 1834 was not really just a spectacle. It was a branding mechanism to sell a vast array of Chinese goods. These were brought to America by the Carnes, who were American merchants whose story in and of itself is pretty fascinating. They had established a very innovative business, which is what really got me interested in Afong Moy in the first place. So the book goes into a great deal of detail on the objects that the Carnes brought, the reason why they brought such a vast array of inexpensive objects for the middle class. And then I look at those interrelated roles of the merchants and the ship captain and his wife and Afong Moy. So that early history is really pretty interesting. In the story of Afong Moy that you've read, Ford includes two people who do have a real place in Afong Moy's life in America. The first person is Afong Moy's eventual manager, Henry Hannington. And Ford portrays him as a pretty vile character. So for years, I researched to find out who Afong Moy's manager was. In the newspaper accounts, he was only designated as a conductor or a manager, but never a name. And I felt that understanding his background probably would unlock more of her story. So after quite a number of years, I finally found him in a most unlikely place. I found him in the minutes of the Medical Society of South Carolina. So in advance of Afong Moy's arrival in Charleston in May of 1835, the conductor of the exhibition invited officers and members of the Society of South Carolina, who would be doctors, to examine her bound feet. The man was identified in the minutes as a Mr. H. Hannington, the conductor of the exhibition of the famous Chinese lady. And his background is interesting. Hannington had worked in New York City as a producer of the popular form of entertainment then, dioramas. You may have heard of them. They're large scenic paintings that appear dimensional and they appear in motion. And they're in motion, they appear in motion because they're lit by lamps. And so you get this sense of activity and action. And so Hannington was very good at this. Hannington expanded, though, into a new arena of public spectacle and sales to include the presentation of Afong Moy and to serve as her manager probably around May 1835. So in the book, I provide a lot of information about Hannington and his wife, Catherine, who traveled with Afong Moy and with her husband as Afong Moy's female chaperone. And their years-long relationship was very interesting to follow. I would say that Hannington is not a particularly sympathetic figure. He did encourage the unwrapping of her bound feet in Charleston, and much later, he committed a travesty against her, which was not physical, but very tumultuous. He's not physically abusive that I had ever heard. I have no evidence of his whipping her or placing her in a brothel or physically harming her as sort of presented in Ford's book. The second character that Ford includes in his story about Afong Moy is kind of what I would call an amalgamation of two historical figures. One emerges at the beginning of her American life, and the other shows up toward the end of what I call her spectacle career. In newspaper accounts in October of 1834, a Chinese man attends her at Captain Aubert's New York City house. This is where the first Chinese salon in America takes place. And it's also, interestingly enough, where Afong Moy lives. So she lives with the ship captain and his wife in a home right in downtown New York City. The man is sometimes called an interpreter in the paper. Sometimes he's called a personal assistant. Sometimes he's called a private secretary. His name is not listed on the Washington passenger manifest. And in the paper, he's called and known as Atong or Akung. And he's said to be 17, and he's said to be lately arrived from Canton. The newspapers effuse about him, and they talk about this very, and I'm going to quote, this very interesting and polished youth whose handsome face and graceful manners and Chinese dress and well-spoken English are of themselves a principal attraction, an attraction at the salon where Afong Moy is being presented. And I'll continue the quote. It says, in fact, Atong moves about with all the grace of a gentleman, and at the same time an excellent cicerone to explain the different curiosities. His hair is shaven in front and behind ends in a long plaited queue of jet black color, and his animated and elegant features and voice are quite fascinating. This is end quote. Well, there's an obvious reason why Atong is needed, because without him, there would be no Afong Moy story on the stage. And without him, the Chinese trade goods or the, what they call different curiosities that she came to hawk would be unexplained. He probably did provide information about Afong Moy's life in China. He probably discussed her bound feet. He probably described the costume she wore, and he surely gave an account of all the objects on stage in the salon. It was really fortunate because two artists in New York City, Rizzo and Brown, delineated this salon event in a lithograph, which is in the book. This lithograph was really widely distributed to the public, and it depicted a lot of the goods that surrounded her, showed Afong Moy sitting on a dais with her bound feet sort of peeping out from beneath the folds of her costume. Atong is not present in the lithograph, which is a shame. And we don't have any pictorial depiction of him. But that a young Chinese man can speak English so well in the United States at this time is really highly unusual. In early 19th century China, the study of the English language was absolutely forbidden. And it was also forbidden to teach the Chinese language to foreigners. In addition, the newspapers noticed that Atong calligraphed individual audiences' names in Chinese, of course, for a fee of 12.5 cents, because the managers made sure to take every advantage to make a buck. But that he had that proficiency was very unusual for very few Chinese males of commoner status, which he probably was, had such literacy skills. It's likely that Atong's presence in New York resulted from one of two situations. Either he was a knowledgeable Chinese trader's servant who decided to remain in America, or he was a missionary protege of some kind of stature. Either position would have given him the opportunity to learn English and perhaps to have a fairly sophisticated knowledge of Chinese writing. In the book, I do spend considerable ink determining his place in the United States at the time, and I investigate also the lives of a few other Chinese men who do come to America very early in the 19th century, and this is really fascinating. Atong is with Afong Moy really less than a year, and he's retired from the presentation in September 1835 in Providence, Rhode Island. And that's probably because at this point, Afong Moy can speak a few words of English, and she can sort of hold her own a bit on stage. But amazingly, I never found his name mentioned again in any recorded documents, in newspaper accounts, or anywhere else. His name never resurfaces. So I hope that I don't give away information for those who may not have yet read the book, but in Ford's story, Afong Moy's interpreter is Nan Choi Yu Tong, who has an intimate and a churlish and a tempestuous relationship with Afong Moy in the book. In the historical account, there's no evidence of a romantic association with Afong Moy with her interpreter. And there's no violent assignation. There's no child that they shared. And you can be sure if there were, it would have hit the papers. Yet, to be fair to Ford's commentary, but really not to his chronology, there is a Chinese man who shows up in Afong Moy's life 12 years later. Ford identifies the Chinese man who translates for and then accosts her in Baltimore in 1835 as Nan Choi Yu Tong. Well, in Troy, New York in 1847, quite a bit after she has arrived in 35, Afong Moy, now under the auspices of P.T. Barnum, is accompanied by a Chinese gentleman who is named in the papers as Yu Tong. 2 years later, a Barnum pamphlet on Afong Moy, and it's a long one. It's, I think it's 7 pages that talks about Afong Moy. Barnum now calls her Afong Moy Nan Choi. And in the little pamphlet that he writes, he notes that visitors can pose questions of any nature to, quote, the gentleman or guardian who is in attendance as her interpreter, as a man of information and extremely communicative, who could provide an even fuller understanding of her Chinese experience. Of course, unfortunately, this time, the interpreter's name is not listed in the pamphlet. Possibly it is Yutong, the same Chinese man who had accompanied her in Troy in 1847. And as you might imagine, I have spent untold hours searching for Yutong and all variations of her name and his name, but to no avail. So in Ford's book, two activities are highlighted in Afong Moy's life. And I'll provide some historical background on both and on the activities and the locations where they take place so that you can get a sense of, comparing the book story and the historical account. One of the sensational attractions that Afong Moy's managers, this would be the Auberts and Hannington, and later, as you've heard, the spoiler alert for my book, P.T. Barnum, they take advantage of Afong Moy's bound feet. This is what everyone was sensationalized about, what they found so titillating. So my book does detail the history and the methods and the issues related to the Chinese custom of bound feet, but it would take really more time than we have here to go into that subject. It's a complicated issue. And so if you are really interested, you can read that in my book. In Ford's book, he related the traumatic ordeal Afong Moy experienced with the unbinding of her feet by medical doctors. And medical doctors did unbind her feet twice. The first time was in Philadelphia in January of 1835, quite soon after she arrives. And there's a reason for that, because show managers attracted Americans with consistent patterns of illusion and deception. So Afong Moy's managers really sort of wanted to assure the public that Afong Moy truly had bound feet. And so to settle the question, they invited 8 quite prominent Philadelphia physicians to unbind her feet. And then they asked the doctors to sign a document, and they published that document in the newspapers. And the document said that indeed her feet were bound and they were very small. Quote, from the heel to the end of the small toe, 2.5 inches. So a number of these doctors who in Philadelphia had unbound her feet had treated the poor at the Philadelphia almshouse. And, I don't want to let them off lightly, but they weren't cruel, they were curious. And really, probably only a few realized the huge taboo that this was in China. I should say that several of those doctors had gone to China as ship doctors. So they'd been on ships that had gone to Guangzhou. So they knew about something about bound feet, but probably none of them considered the trauma that it might cause for Afong Moy. They don't do physical harm to her feet. They don't break her bones, as I think Ford implies. Still, and I won't whitewash this, it was really a terrible affront because Chinese women with bound feet did not expose them to men at all, certainly not to men outside their family, and it would have been extremely shameful. It was almost like disrobing, really. Well, this wasn't the last time. In May of 1835, the same thing happened in Charleston. And remember, I'd mentioned earlier that Hannington had instigated this by writing in advance to the doctors in South Carolina, offering the opportunity. And here again, there were 8 doctors who were in attendance, and they examined her feet. And again, they were asked to provide authenticity that she really had small feet. But in doing research on these doctors, their background was pretty different from those in Philadelphia. And none of those doctors in Charleston had been to China. None practiced in almshouses, and most all of them were slaveholders. But again, they did not break any bones. But unfortunately, things went further in Charleston. And it was here that Hannington required Afong Moy to unwrap her feet for public display. This is not just for the doctors, but for the general public. You pay an admission and you see her unbound feet. An article in the Charleston paper noted that, quote, "The lady's foot, divested of its bandages, will, on this occasion, be exposed to inspection of the curious. It is with great reluctance that we understand that she has consented to this, believing as she does that it compromises her delicacy," end quote. Now, this probably didn't occur in Philadelphia because the doctors at least knew enough to object to the public display, knowing that this was a huge humiliation for Afong Moy. But it did happen in Charleston, which was pretty awful. So another episode that figures pretty largely in Ford's story is it occurs in Baltimore, Maryland. And Afong Moy did travel to Baltimore in early March of 1835. It was only 6 months after she had arrived in America. I'm not sure at this point that Hannington was Afong Moy's manager at the time, though Ford does portray him as such in the book. But I don't think he was her manager then. She was presented to the public in what was then the Peel Museum, which had been recently moved to Calvert Street. And the museums at the time, and this was not unusual, would supplement the attractions of their permanent museum collection with programs like the Chinese Salon with Afong Moy. So this was pretty typical of museums to do. But in spending time going through lots of diaries in Baltimore institutions, I found fascinating details about Afong Moy's experience there. Diary accounts and a particularly revealing letter from a 17-year-old Margaret Gibson to her brother John in New York, who, interestingly enough, had seen Afong Moy in New York, gives us a really tender and remarkably honest assessment of Afong Moy. In a portion of her letter, she acutely notes, quote, "Poor thing, she is much to be pitied. She seems very timid and confused," end quote. Now, this is sort of interesting because Margaret Gibson was probably about the same age as Afong Moy, and she kind of took in the measure of Afong Moy, kind of seeing her as she might have felt if she were in China, and experiencing this kind of display. Gibson also took a measure of Atong, and she noted that he seemed to be finding a lot of pleasure in his surroundings. And according to Gibson, and it was probably recounted by Afong Moy professed to really like Baltimore more than any other city that she had visited. Apparently, the people there were really kind and attentive, and she appreciated that. Sort of unlike in the Ford book, there were no lotteries where names were drawn out of a rice bowl, nor did the manager parade her around in an open carriage, nor did Afong Moy attempt to kill her Chinese interpreter. However, all this makes for a great story. I understand that. So you might wonder then how the research for my book took place. In the 1980s, I did a PhD dissertation on early 1800s Chinese objects and material culture in America. And in that process, I did find Afong Moy's name in a New York City newspaper associated with the presentation of Chinese goods. And remember, this is what I was really interested in. I was doing work on these kinds of things, noting objects that were being presented to the public in newspapers. Another newspaper noticed the presence of a catalog, which was distributed at her New York City salon in 1834. And I assumed that this was published by the Carnes cousins, the American merchants who had financed Afong Moy's trip to America. Yet no one had ever referenced or noticed or noted the existence of this catalog. So I tucked away the information and I went on with my research for the dissertation. But Afong Moy's presence and just the whole aspect of what she might have experienced stayed with me for several years after. And I decided, after I finished the dissertation, to continue research on her life and her place in American culture. So I started by reading every newspaper record I could find on her travels. So I sort of stitched together an itinerary of those travels and a chronology of her life based on these accounts in the newspaper. Then for many years, I went to nearly every city and town where she performed or lived. So be New York City, District of Columbia, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Albany, New York, Charleston, Boston, Providence, Worcester, Salem, Mammoth, New Jersey, and etc. So I also had good colleagues, and I deputized them who lived or traveled or went to any of these locations to assist in the historical research. And one stalwart colleague did research in Havana, Cuba, where amazingly Afong Moy also presented with Hannington. In these locations, I sort of burrowed into the collections of historical societies and libraries and archives, sifting through diaries and letters and any other written or visual materials that might provide a record of her life. I made some fascinating finds. And because I had seen the reference to this catalog, every institution I went to and did research in, I searched for it. And after my continued presence at one New York City library, the reference librarian got enthused about the topic, and also I think she was a little tired of my constant questions. And so she willingly opened up an as yet unprocessed and very old collection that had not really been reviewed, and she let me go through it. And there, to our delight, I did find the catalog. And as an aside, it's in the Samuel Tilden papers. And Tilden was the governor of New York, and he also ran for president in 1876. And as a young man, he likely went to see Afong Moy in New York City, and he just kept the catalog and shoved it in with all of his other papers. Well, its presence is really significant because it was the first published and public catalog of Chinese goods in America. And wonderfully, it had an image of Afong Moy, and it's the one you saw in the opening slide for the talk. So I was so pleased to find it. In addition to finding the catalog, I really went through diary accounts of those who saw her. So in every city and in historical societies in those cities, I went through diaries that related to the time period when she was in the city. I located poems that were written about her at the time, because people who saw her in different cities did write about her in poetry. And I found broadsides, which were placed on lampposts that advertised her presence in the town. So I found many wonderful materials on the varied aspects of her life. And all of these documents provide commentary not only on Afong Moy, but really significantly on how Americans viewed China and the Chinese at the time. So it was fascinating to understand how Americans viewed objects that were Chinese, viewed Afong Moy as a Chinese woman, and just generally their response to life in China. I haven't mentioned many other aspects of Afong Moy's life because they don't figure in Ford's book, such as her visit with President Andrew Jackson at the president's house in Washington, D.C., her 8 years in a poor house, or afterwards her life with P.T. Barnum and her experience with Tom Thumb. So you might wonder if Afong Moy expressed any emotional response to any of the experiences that we were going through, the experiences in Baltimore or any of the cities that she traveled through. She wasn't literate and she didn't speak much English, but yet we do get glimpses of her reaction to events through diary accounts and newspaper accounts and even the poetry. When she was pitied in one city for her bound feet, she in turn reacted to American women's large feet, saying they were too big, no good. When she was accused on stage of being a heathen and approached on stage by a woman that said such a thing, she burst into tears. When she was required to unbind her feet in Charleston, she did express shame. And upon seeing a balloon ascension, she was really distressed and very fearful, probably thinking, oh my gosh, I don't hope anyone's going to put me in a balloon and send me off the way I was sent off in a ship to America. And when meeting the President of the United States, she expressed sort of amazement at his accessibility and amazement at his lack of magnificence, both in attire and a lack of grandeur in the president's house. All these affective and responses are really valuable and give us some indication of her feeling and her thoughts. So we last really do hear of Afong Moy in Cleveland, Ohio in February 1851. And there she presented under Barnum's management to celebrate the completion of the Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati railroads. The book details the reasons for Barnum's dwindling interest in her, and eventually, after 17 years, her name no longer appears in any of the papers. So I spent months chasing down every possible lead, using every combination of her name to determine her later existence, consulting genealogists and a scholar who worked on the Moy family history, but nothing. And I hate to disappoint, but I found no descendants yet. My hope is that with the release of the book, someone would come forth to claim kinship, but so far, not a word. I realized that Doctor the novelist, sort of like Ford, was not really concerned with, what actually happened in many ways, but Ford, like Dr. O, worked to bring history problems into focus. And I like Dr. O's quote about rewriting history that seemed kind of apt to Ford's book. Quote, "History is a nightmare. We can best survive by rewriting it." So thanks. And now I'm willing to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Nancy. That was really fascinating. All right, our first question, someone is asking if you can describe the objects that you refer to. I think maybe they mean, the objects that she was helping to sell.
Yes, absolutely, which was, for me, the really fascinating thing about this. She was presenting really not expensive objects, such as fans and small tables and teacups, teapots, and shawls, and very small things that really middle-class people could buy and own inexpensive, have inexpensive things that they could have in their home that would give them a sense of what China was all about. So small things that were possible to buy cheaply and inexpensively. And I have 3 chapters on those objects in the book. So lots of information about objects.
Gotcha. All right, thanks. We have another question. It says, as someone so familiar with the historical accounts and records, did you enjoy Jamie Ford's book overall? And thank you for weaving together historical artifacts into this talk. It was wonderful to hear the historical context.
Yeah, I did enjoy it. I mean, it's a story, and I really felt that the weaving the thread through his eugenics, that was fascinating. How he used that to thread that story through all the generations. Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a good read.
All right. Would you speculate on what you think might have happened to Afong after she sort of fell out of the public record?
Yeah, I always think that the simplest explanation is sometimes the most logical. And the areas that she would be familiar with would be New York City and New Jersey. She spent time with Aubert in New York. She knew it, and she had come back to New York with Hannington. And then she spent a long time, 8 years, in New Jersey in a poorhouse. So it is my sense that if she were anywhere, she would have been in New York City or New Jersey. And so, of course, I spent all my time looking through poorhouse records and all kinds of data, there's not a lot of census data that I could find that would help me with this, but no, I couldn't find anything except that I think that makes logical sense.
And how would she have been able even to support herself if she was sort of on her own, cast aside? What would have been her options besides the poor? Would there have been any options for her?
Not much.
Yeah.
The only thing that I could think of is that she perhaps married. There were Chinese sailors that came into the port of New York, and I did find record that some stayed, some did not go back. And it's possible that she married a Chinese sailor and lived in New York City. But otherwise, it would be the poorhouse, unfortunately.
Wow. So sad. When did Chinese women, so she's purportedly the first Chinese woman to come to the US, right?
Mhm.
When did Chinese women begin to arrive in larger numbers, and what might have precipitated that?
Yeah. Well, actually, the next flow of Chinese women would have been in the West.
Mm.
With the gold rush in 1849, a lot of Chinese came for the gold rush, and not too much after that, some women came. And so I did actually do some research and did some writing on Chinese women in the West, in California. And so they were coming either to be with family who had come, or were coming because one particular woman came because she could make money, and she established a brothel, and she did very well, actually.
Interesting. Yeah. All right. How about one more question? Also, another person is asking the title of Nancy's book, which is The Chinese
Yeah.
Lady,
Yep. So you can,
Afong Moy in Early America. There you
right.
go.
Yeah.
And it is available through the library, so feel free to check it out.
Good.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you first became interested in Asian studies?
Well, I liked to read as a kid. And when I was 10 or 12, I read quite a few books about China. And I was so enthusiastic that I thought I would make my own Chinese scroll, which I got some long sheets of paper, put them all together, and pretended I was doing calligraphy. But I thought, it needs to look old. So I took matches and burned the bottoms, except that I caught, unfortunately, it caught fire in my room, and I was in big trouble. But I did have what looked like an authentic Chinese scroll, burned at the edges. I was told that I, could try a different kind of artwork in the future. So that was, and I've always loved China and have read about it, for most of my life. And then in college, went on to study it, and then graduate school.
And have you spent a lot of time in China?
That one trip to China, and I certainly intended to go back, but it's just not been too favorable to go back. So it was, I loved China. I absolutely loved China, and it was my hope to go back a couple of years later, but it just didn't, the environment didn't seem right for me to go back.
Mhm.
But I do hope to go back.
Yeah. There's still time.
Yeah.
All right, well, I think that is all the questions we have. Thank you so much, Nancy, for being here. I know, oh, someone says, don't give up. I've been to China 3 times and love it too.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you so much for it's really having the context of her as a real person, I think actually really just enhances the novel. So this has been great.
good. Well, it's great fun to do it. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, we're thrilled. All
Okay,
right. Take care,
thanks.
Nancy.
Bye-bye.
Everyone. Thanks for coming.